All right, good morning, or at least it's good morning for me. I don't know when you're listening. We are jumping into concept 3, which is anatomy basics, and I'm so excited because I feel like we're now really getting into the core and the true intro to what this course is going to all be about. So, let's jump in. Just a little overview. Anatomy, what is it? It's a study of bodily structures. And we can kind of look at anatomy several ways, but the main two ways are one is gross anatomy, so macroscopic, macro meaning big, just looking big picture at maybe just the different body systems. And then there's also microanatomy, looking at anatomy and bodily structures from a microscopic level. So looking at it more on the tissue and cellular levels. The study of tissues is called histology, and then the study of cells is called cytology. So we did a little intro with cytology back in concept 1 if for the research and report activity, just looking at some different cells. And we're going to talk more about tissues in this concept. But both of these, we're going to integrate all of this. We're not going to do microanatomy or just do cytology. Nothing in this course is going to be taught in isolation. It's all going to be integrated. And that also applies to physiology, which is the study of bodily functions. So how things work together. Remember, I told you the main theme of this course that I'm writing for my people is form dictates function. Okay, so how does the anatomy dictate the physiology? So I don't want this to be your traditional anatomy course where y'all are just making thousands upon thousands of flashcards and memorizing all these terms and just labeling diagrams. Of course, we will label diagrams and we will learn terms, but I want more than anything for you to understand how the structure, how the cells, which make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems, which make up these organisms, us humans, how they work together on all these different levels to accomplish different functions of life and thus maintain homeostasis. Remember, we talked about in concept 2 that functionally we have a dynamic equilibrium that's happening. So it's not static. We're not always constantly stable. Things ebb and flow within a range. And that is maintained at that organ system level, at that gross or macro level, but it's also maintained all the way down to a cellular or micro level. So we're going to be talking about every level in every unit and in every concept. They're all going to come up. They're all going to be incredibly, incredibly integrated. Nothing is working in isolation. It's impossible to talk about one organ without talking about another, or to learn about one organ system without referring to another. So as we go through this course and we start diving into the organ systems, we're going to be learning them together. We're never just going to learn one. Every unit's going to have several in them, and then we'll build upon those. So in Unit 5, we're going to be referring back to things from Unit 2. And so it's super important that y'all are really learning this content and not just memorizing facts, because that's not going to last several months from now when we're still building on stuff we've learned. And so what I want to do here as we jump into these anatomy basics is I just want to give you a super brief overview of the organ systems. Of course, we're going to go in much more depth into each one of these, and you're actually going to do a little project for me in this concept that's going to get you learning a bit more about one of them. But I just feel like we need to have some sense of where we're going to be going in this curriculum. So I'm excited to jump in with that with you now. So first, skeletal system. This is one of our main organ systems. Its function is providing support. So I highlighted the key words in each one if you are like the bare bones minimum note taker. But it's for support, it's for protection of our internal organs. Think about how your skull just protects your brain, or your rib cage provides so much protection for all of the organs within it. And then, of course, it helps us be able to move. Key structures are our bones, of course, but there's more there. There's our tendons and our ligaments and our cartilage. So there's a lot that makes up the skeletal system, more than meets the eye, if you will. There's actually 206 bones in our human body, which is pretty fascinating. The femur being our longest, which is in your thigh, and then the smallest being in your inner ear. Teeny tiny bones in there, but we'll get more into that. All right, let's talk about the muscular system. Muscular system's main function is movement and then just stabilization also. Main components are muscle tissue, which there's 3 types we'll talk about in a bit when we get into intro to histology. There's skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac muscle tissue. And there are over 600 100 muscles in the human body. And it believes that one of the largest muscles is in our jaws, which is pretty cool. All right, the nervous system. Main function is to collect, process, and respond to sensory information and to control. To control voluntary, but also the involuntary reflex actions or things that your body's just doing without you really thinking twice about it. So this includes the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We're talking about the brain and the spinal cord, but then also all of the nerves and all of your sensory organs. Your organs that allow you to taste things and hear things. All of those are included in this system. Key cells we'll be talking about are your nerve cells, which are also known as neurons. And there's other important ones too, but this is the big one, which we'll be talking about. All right, the endocrine system. The endocrine system's main function is production and secretion of hormones for regulation of the body. So growth, metabolism, sexual development. And we're going to learn the endocrine system when we learn the nervous system, because this has to do with regulation, and the nervous system has to do with control. So those go hand in hand. That's why we're going to kind of learn them together. Key structures are the hypothalamus and then a bunch of different glands like the pituitary and the adrenal and the thyroid that are just going to do a lot for us. This is where the signaling and communication we talked about in concept 2 is really, really going to come up a lot. All right, the cardiovascular system. This is also known as the circulatory system in a lot of textbooks. My reference for my students is going to be the Mary B textbook, and they use cardiovascular, so that's just what I'm using for consistency. The point of this system is gas exchange and nutrient transport to and from cells throughout the body. I almost said bloody because I want to say blood. Blood is going to be very important and a big part of our discussion when we cover this system. So structures like your heart and the blood vessels, and then of course, obviously your blood are going to come up a lot in this one. And we can't talk about that one, I feel like, without talking about the respiratory system, which also aids in gas exchange, really taking in oxygen, making sure our cells are oxygenated, and then removing carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of cellular respiration, which happens in the mitochondria. Why does it happen? Because we need that ATP. See how integrated this all is. If you were so bored in Concept 1 with all that biology review, I hope even if you're bored, you committed it to memory because it's just going to keep coming back up. All right, so key structures, lungs, our nose, that nasal passageway, our mouth, trachea, diaphragm, all these things we'll be talking about. All right, then we've got our digestive system. Its main function is breaking down our food and then absorbing the nutrients from that food into our body. And then the key structures are going to be our mouth, our stomach, and our intestines. The urinary system, its main function is maintaining water balance and then getting rid of waste, regulating blood volume and pressure, and filtering blood. The kidneys do so many things, y'all, that I think we really overlook. And so we'll be spending a lot of time on the kidney. And then, of course, we'll talk about your bladder as well. Sometimes people refer to the urinary system as part of the excretory system. So we're going to be talking about excretions and all of that all within this concept. All right, the integumentary system. Now, a lot of people teach the integumentary system with the muscle and skeletal system. I'm actually going to teach it to my students with the immune system. And that's because this system is one of the biggest players in your immune system and keeping you healthy, because it's this giant physical barrier that protects your body from the outside world. And then it also helps with maintaining homeostasis by regulating your body temperature, controlling how much water is lost. So it plays some really big roles. And so we'll be looking at your skin, your hair, your nails, and then a bunch of glands that are associated with that. And I'm going to teach it in conjunction with the immune system, because the immune system and lymphatic systems are really tricky. And so I think the integumentary system is an easier one to grasp. And so I think together it'll make it a lot clearer for us. So, main function: defend, deflect, and destroy infectious agents that make their way into our body. Now, some people will look at these separate and we'll say there's 12 major organ systems and immune and lymphatic are separate. We're going to look at 11 major organ systems, and because we're just going to kind of push these two together. And the reason being is they share the same organs. They're both using the same organs. But really the lymphatic system to me is more connected to the circulatory or the cardiovascular connected to those systems. And then the immune system is more connected to the endocrine. So, but again, we're looking at everything in connection with every body system. But these two for sure. Key structures will be lymph nodes and blood vessels and thymus and bone marrow and spleen, all to protect against and get rid of these types of pathogens. And I think this is going to be a fascinating unit because we're really going to get to talk about disease and learn a lot of really fascinating things about it. All right, and then last but not least, we'll cover the reproductive system and development of an organism in the womb. So main function is to allow animals to reproduce, which just means make babies. And that has to start by producing egg and sperm. And then it involves a lot of hormones, of course, fertilization. And then we'll also talk about the nurturing and developing of offspring in the female womb. So we'll really have to look at the whole male reproductive system, which mainly includes the testes and penis. And then we'll also look at the female, of course, too. Vagina, uterus, ovaries, all of that jazz. And so we're going to move on now in the notes to anatomical terminology and vocabulary. But if you're in class, we're going to stop and do a really fun project that I think you're going to really enjoy. Excuse me. But for the sake of the video, let's keep going. So, in Intro to Anatomy, there are a ton of vocab words. We just can't get away from the terminology. And so these are some of the basics that you're going to need to know throughout this whole year. This is where you're going to want to get out that Quizlet or those flashcards or whatever it may be. But first is the anatomical position, which we have pictured here. It's where a person is standing up with their feet slightly apart and their arms at their side. And this is a standard position, and we use it as a reference point. So when we're trying to show where something is directionally, we have to have some standard to go off of. So this is our standard that we're looking at. And one thing that's important to consider too is when we're looking at a person in the anatomical position, right is their right, left is their left. So just picture if you were this person, this would be your right side and this would be your left side. So keep that in mind because that can get tricky. Right and left are from his or her perspective, not ours. And there's some regional terms we use to try to narrow down what part of the body we're looking at. So axial is looking at our head and neck and trunk area, kind of just like our core. Axial comes from axis. So what's coming off the main axis of the body. And then appendicular is referring to our appendages or our limbs. So everything that's attached to the axis. So if we wanted to very basically divide the body into two regions, these would typically be the two that we do. There are so many other regional terms though, like we can refer to your, abdominal region or your pelvic region or your pubic region, but we are going to do that in a little activity now in class, and then we'll come back to the rest of this. But again, for the sake of the video, we're moving on. So to be able to talk about where different things are located, we have to be able to use directional terms. And so these are super important to know. The first is superior, which is also known as cranial. So that's the fun part about pretty much every biology-related course you'll ever be in. Everything has multiple names, so get to know those interchangeably. We're referring to toward the upper part or above. So anything above, think cranial like your cranium, so we're thinking upwards. So example, I could say the chin right here is superior. It's above your abdomen. Okay, so that's one way we could use this. I think writing the examples would be really helpful in your notes, just so you have context for how to use these. All right, the opposite would be inferior or caudal. So away from the upper part or towards the lower part or below. So your knees are inferior to your navel, your belly button. They're below it. Okay, those are two of our directional terms. Next, all right, so looking at this guy from a different angle, anterior means toward or at the front of the body, so in front of. So the chin is anterior to your spine, it's in front of it. Whereas posterior means toward or at the back of the body, so behind. So your spine is posterior to your heart. Now, in parentheses, I also put that anterior can be interchanged with ventral and posterior can be interchanged with dorsal. But my vertebrate biology professor in college would be completely dismayed if I didn't clarify this here. We can use anterior and ventral and posterior and dorsal interchangeably in humans, but we cannot do that in four-legged animals. And this is because anterior is referring to the leading portion of the body. So this front in humans, which if you're a four-legged animal like a dog, that's actually your head rather than your abdominal surface, which is what it is in humans. Ventral specifically means belly. So for us, anterior and ventral are the same because this is our leading surface. This is also our belly. Whereas in a dog, anterior would be the dog's head and ventral would be the dog's belly. So those would not be interchangeable in a four-legged animal. And then the same goes for posterior and dorsal. So think of even a different animal like a shark, not necessarily four-legged, but the tail would be posterior, it'd be behind, it'd be at the back, but their actual back would be dorsal. So like opposite of its belly is the back, which would be dorsal. Whereas our back and our tail are the same. So they're both posterior and they're both dorsal. So not trying to confuse you, and that may have come off way more confusing than I intended. Just know that these are used interchangeably. This is in humans, and this is a human anatomy and physiology course. We can't apply this interchangeable words in another like anatomy course that you might have. All right, medial is toward or at the midline of the body, so on the inner side of. So your heart is medial to your arm, it's more towards the midline. Lateral is away from the midline of the body on the outer side of. So the arms are lateral to your chest. And then if we want to talk about in between, we would use the term intermediate. All right, proximal means closer to the point where a limb attaches to the body trunk. So that's what these stars are showing, where your limbs attach to the body trunk. And so proximal would be towards those points. So your elbow is proximal to the wrist. It's closer to the attachment point than the wrist is. Whereas distal means farther from the point where the limb attaches to the body trunk. So moving away from there. So the toes are distal to the knee. They're further from the attachment point. All right, and then last two for directional terms. Superficial just means external, so toward or at the body surface. So your skin is superficial to your bones. And then deep or internal means away from the body surface. So the heart is deep to the rib cage. All right, so body planes or sections. To study the human body, we often section it off along flat surfaces called planes. And these are kind of the three most frequently used we're going to discuss. And these are really important when we're looking at diagnostic tests like MRI scans or other sorts of scans like that, because doctors want to be able to look at the same organ but at different angles. So they may cut it different ways with these planes in order to diagnose a disease or something like that. So we'll talk about each one, and of course some of these have multiple words, so that's always fun. Sagittal is a vertical plane, and it would cut right here, and it divides the body into right and left sections. If it's going right through your midline, we would say it's a mid-sagittal plane or a median plane. Whereas if it's cutting off the midline, like maybe over like his nipple or something, we would say it's a parasagittal plane. Another cut we can do, another plane or sectioning off we can do is a frontal, or sometimes it's referred to as coronal. It's a vertical plane that divides the body into anterior, so the front portion, and posterior, the back portion. And then transverse is a cross section. It's a horizontal plane that divides the body into superior above and then inferior below sections. In class, we're gonna kind of stop and do a little activity with this, but for now, again, we're gonna keep pressing through. Another way we can look at the way your body's kind of organized is through body cavities. So we typically divide the body into two membrane-lined internal cavities that protect the organs within them, and each have two major subdivisions. So first, we have your dorsal body cavity. It's part of the axial portion of your body, so the trunk, and it's encased in bony structures for protection because it's housing your fragile nervous system organs. And within the dorsal body cavity, we're looking at your cranial cavity, which holds your brain, and your vertebral or spinal cavity, which holds your spinal cord within the bony vertebrae. All right, so that's your dorsal body cavity. The other major one is your ventral body cavity. And this is also part of your axial portion. We're looking at your trunk, but it's less protected, but that also means it has more mobility. It's housing all of your visceral organs, so just your so a lot of your internal organs within there. And it makes up your thoracic cavity, which holds your heart and your lungs, and which can be subdivided even further into your pleural cavities, which holds your lung, and your pericardial cavity, which holds the heart, esophagus, and trachea. And then it could also be subdivided into your abdominopelvic cavity, which holds your abdomen and your pelvis. So, a little bit more about that abdominopelvic cavity, because it's an important one. We can divide that one more into your abdomen and your pelvis. So, your abdominal cavity holds your stomach and your intestines, your spleen, your liver, as well as a bunch of other things. And then your pelvic cavity is holding your bladder, a couple of your reproductive organs, and then your rectum. And it's all protected by your pelvis. We often take this cavity and we divide it into 4 quadrants. So you'd have your right upper quadrant and your left upper quadrant and your right lower quadrant and your left lower quadrant. Remember, right is for them, not your right, and left is their left. But you can even subdivide it even further. You can actually divide this into 9 parts if you want to get even more specific and talk about your epigastric region or your right hypochondriac region or your umbilical region. But I'm not going to have my students memorize those. Some other body cavities that are much, much smaller and tend to actually have an external opening also. All of those other ones we talked about did not. Your oral cavity, this is like your mouth and your teeth and your tongue. Your digestive cavity, which connects the oral cavity all the way down to your rectum. Your nasal cavity, which is within and behind the nose. Your orbital cavities, which hold your eyes. Your middle ear cavities, which contain tiny bones between your eardrums. Your synovial cavities, which have to do with your joints. So all these other little ones too. All right. Body membranes. Last thing anatomical terminology wise we need to cover. We said that your body cavities we just covered are all membrane lined, and the organs that make them up are also membrane lined. So we need to talk about what those membranes are. There's the cutaneous membrane, which is your skin. It's covering your body's surface. It's our only dry membrane. The rest are wet. We've got your mucous membranes, which line all your body cavities that open to the outside of the body. So think like your nasal cavity and your mouth, those kinds of things. We have the serous membrane or serosa. This lines ventral body cavities that are closed as well as covering many of your organs. It can be subdivided into parietal membrane, which lines the body cavity, and then the visceral membrane, which covers your internal organs. And these are separated by serous fluid. And then your meninges, which is the membrane that covers your brain and spinal cord, which are a part of your dorsal body cavity. So in class now, we're going to stop and do one of my favorite activities of all time. But again, for the sake of the video, we're going to power through and do a little intro to histology and talk about tissues. Now, this is going to be very brief. We're going to do some lab stations that you're going to dive much more in depth to, but I just want to get you an overview before we get into those. So, remember, groups of cells that are similar in structure and work together for a common function are called tissues. And then a structure that's made up of at least 2 different types of tissues is called an organ. So that's kind of where we are in the organization, hierarchy of organization in a human. And there's 4 types of tissues that make up all organs: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And a lot of organs actually have all 4 tissues in them. And so that's something we're going to look at. Here's an example of your organ, the stomach. It has smooth muscle tissue, loose connective nervous tissue. It has blood, which is a type of connective tissue. And it has columnar epithelium, which is one of the epithelial tissues. So it has all 4 in there. So we're going to talk about each one of these. So first, your epithelial tissue, also known as epithelium or epithelia for plural. It covers your body surfaces and lines body cavities to form boundaries to protect, absorb, and filter. So an example of this is the epidermis of your skin creates a boundary between the inside and outside of your body. So it's covering and also protecting in a boundary. Epithelial tissue also makes up glands, which are 1 or more cells that create and secrete different products, such as hormones. And they can be exocrine, meaning externally secreting, or they can be endocrine, meaning internally secreting within the human body. We can also identify glands as uni or multicellular based on the number of cells that make them up. So that's something to consider too. We can classify epithelial tissues a couple of ways. One way is by the number of cell layers. So a simple 1 layer versus stratified, which would be more than 1. So simple, we see all of these are just 1 layer, whereas stratified, we can see here are all more than one layer. Classification can also be based on the cell shape. So squamous, which is kind of like this squished or flattened cell, boidal, which looks like cubes, and then columnar, which looks like columns. So think again about our theme of form dictating function. These different cell shapes have different functions based on what their shape is. So thinking, for instance, what would simple, just these thin lines, be most useful for? Well, probably absorption, secretion, and filtration, because it's a thin barrier for things to have to get through. And that is the case. An example of simple squamous and how it's used is in the air sacs of our lungs and in the lining of our heart. Simple cuboidal is used in the surface of our ovaries and ducts and small glands. And then simple columnar is in the lining of our digestive tract. So all of these, their form dictates their function. And identification is easier for simple tissue, but it can be a lot trickier for stratified, especially like when we get into pseudostratified and transitional and all these other things. So it's really best if you just kind of look at the apical layer of the cells as opposed to the basal layer. So when we're talking about the apical layer, we're talking about kind of the outside. And then remembering too, when you're looking at tissues, yes, it's tricky. It takes practice. It's tricky for me too. Because oftentimes a picture is showing multiple types of tissue in one. So we're going to practice this a lot and hopefully we'll get good at identifying. But we definitely want to know some of the basics. All right, let's talk connective tissue. It is here for support, protection, insulation, transport, and binding other tissues together. The 4 types are connective tissue proper, which includes fats like adipose and the fibrous tissues of our ligaments. It specializes in insulation and protection of our organs, and it acts as a fuel reserve to store energy, because of course that's what fat does. Cartilage, it supports, cushions, protects from external environment. Bone is also doing that, just in a different way. And then blood specializes in transport. Connective tissue is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue in the entire human body, but how much is within each organ really varies. So for instance, your skin is almost entirely connective tissue, with, of course, we talked about your epidermis as epithelial tissue, but your brain has really little connective tissue. So those are just some distinctions. All right, we're going to break down each one just for a second. So there's different types of connective tissue proper. It can be loose like these, or it can be dense, so you can kind of see the difference in the pictures in terms of how they look. We also have different types of cartilage, hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. All of them resist compressions, and they're able to do that by holding large amounts of water. So that's one way they kind of protect against those. And then your bone or osseous tissue, it resists compression and tension, of course, and it's extremely hard, which makes it so good for support. And it can be compact, which we can kind of see here in the picture, or it can appear a bit more spongy. And then blood. This is your fluid tissue, which is made of blood cells, which is surrounded by blood plasma. And your blood carries oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients and waste and other things like hormones throughout your body. It's so, so important. We'll spend a whole concept on it. All right, y'all are doing awesome. 2 more. We're almost there. Muscle tissue. It's made of tightly packed together cells that allow for contractions to cause movement. 3 types are skeletal, which attach to bones and control our voluntary movements. Smooth muscles control involuntary movement. They propel substances or passages along internal passageways. So like they are there in your birth canal, helping to propel the baby through the birth canal, that kind of thing. And then cardiac are in your heart. And they have to do with the involuntary contractions in the heart that propel blood into circulation throughout your body. So these are all super important too. And then last but certainly not least is the nervous tissue. It's the main component of our nervous system organs, and it's a part of controlling regulation and communication. It's making up your brain and your spinal cord and your nerves. And it's mainly composed of neurons, which are highly specialized nerve cells that generate and conduct nerve impulses. So they have a cell body, they have these dendrites, and then they have this long axon. Those are kind of their 3 parts. And now we're going to dive into these much deeper with our Exploring Tissues lab stations. Thanks for hanging in there, guys. I know that was long.